also, is there a distinction between compassion in general with self-compassion?
Compassion, by definition, even if you look at the Latin, passion means to suffer, come means with. You know, part of the definition of compassion is the shared nature of suffering. So we need to be aware of what's going on. We can't avoid it or suppress it or pretend it's not there, but also we can't be fused with it. We need some space, and that's provided by mindfulness. When we understand that we aren't alone, we're also understanding that we're all interconnected.
Well, I just want to do more. I think this whole desire to give and connect is just profound.
So feelings of compassion and care were really essential to the survival of the species. So again, that's why it's such an illusion to think of us as separate, because your emotions impact me and my emotions impact you. And if we don't spend any time paying attention to it, if all our time is spent, I don't know, with our phones or working or accumulating wealth, then we aren't even aware, like that muscle just atrophies, you might say.
Yeah. So you've talked about how common humanity and interdependence, interconnection are so real and so important. So do you see any connection between self-compassion, which is your specialty, and compassion for the earth? Does this interconnection extend to, let's say, all of life, all living ecosystems, and the earth itself?
Take it as far as you want to go, right?
Right.
And so to be honest, when I was first formulating my ideas of self-compassion, it was the time I was actually studying in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, he's one of the teachers, Buddhist teachers, who talks a lot about self-compassion. And he also talks about what he likes to term interbeing, right? Which is even a deeper way of thinking about interconnectedness. It's not just interconnectedness in the sense of, hey, we all affect each other and we're all in the same boat. It really goes deeper in the sense that causes and conditions co-arise to create one another. Beautiful. Right? You can't have a piece of paper without the cloud that creates the rain, that waters the trees, which, it's like all these factors need to come together in order, for instance, a piece of paper to exist. And so if you really, the wisdom of common humanity, when it goes broad enough, points to the fact that, quite literally, we're interdependent. We can't take one piece out of the whole. If I start to trace back what affects my ability to live right now, or what brought myself into being, in terms of the backward motion, pretty much all goes back to the Big Bang eventually, right? Yeah. In terms of what's happening right now, everything is interconnected. Yeah. The fact that I'm able to exist, if you look at the power that's lighting this room, my clothes, my food, the water, and you start, again, tracing it back. Well, what allows that to, my water? Well, what allows that to be the case? What allows that to be the case? And again, eventually it just stretches out infinitely in every direction. And so, I like, sometimes I talk about self-compassion. If you take it deep enough, it really is a spiritual practice. If you really open your heart and open your mind as wide as they can go, then it does start to embrace everything, which is, the earth, and even beyond the earth, if you really were to go all the way to the entire universe, but certainly the earth, right? So if I harm the earth, I'm harming myself.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So, and that way it is an act of self-compassion to protect the earth. Because again, this illusion that we're separate, it's just an illusion. It ain't so.
It ain't so.
It ain't so, because if the earth dies, I die too. If the earth suffers, I suffer too. And it's sad that I think in our modern society we're so cut off from this basic truth. We don't live out in nature very much. We just stay in our little isolated pods. And it's very easy to forget how interconnected we are with nature. It is. Unless something happens like the California wildfires and you can't go outside. Sometimes things happen and you realize, oh yeah, that's right. Things outside impact me, but most of the time we just forget about it.
I'd like to come back to that in a moment, but to get to that next set of questions, I'd like to ask you please to help us understand the two faces of compassion that you described, both tender and fierce.
Yes.
Later on, we're going to ask how we can apply them and, in facing
Yes.
and healing the earth. Yeah.
Right. I like to draw on the metaphor of yin and yang, which is borrowed from Chinese philosophy, because I think it's just such a really beautiful way to capture these two principles of life. So in Chinese philosophy, they talk about the yin energy. And so most people are familiar with the yin and yang symbol, the light and the dark, and the idea is these two energies are constantly in dialectic and they kind of fold into each other.
Yeah.
So the yin energy of life is more of a tender, softer, nurturing energy. And this energy is all about kind of being with what is, opening to what is in a very yielding, receptive way. But there's also the more fierce yang energy to life, which is all about doing, acting, achieving, kind of being fierce, being protective, doing what we need to do to get things done and changing. And self-compassion, if compassion is about the alleviating of suffering, there are really two main ways we alleviate suffering. One way to alleviate suffering is by holding our suffering tenderly. We be with our pain as it is. It's kind of like a mother might just kind of hold a child who is crying, and you soothe your child and just hold your child, loving that child. Doesn't matter if the child's screaming, you love that child. And eventually the child starts to calm down. That's the nurturing energy of life.
Yeah.
But so, if your form of suffering is the fact that you're on the second floor and a fire has broken out on the floor below you, you don't want to just sit there like being with yourself tenderly, right? You need to do something. You need to act bravely. You may need to risk your life to jump out the window, or you might need to protect yourself from harm, or you might need to motivate some change because there's something about your life that shouldn't be accepted because it's harming you. And so that's what I call fierce self-compassion. That's our ability to take action, to make change, and to protect ourselves, and also to meet our needs, right? To actually actively go out and take the concrete steps we need to be well and to be fulfilled. And one without the other is incomplete. And when they're out of balance, it causes problems. If we have yin without yang, we're just complacent, right? Maybe we're happy and soothed and we feel safe, but if if everything's going to hell in a handbasket around us, we're unhealthy. That's not good. We're complacent. On the other hand, if we're too fierce without enough tenderness, if we're all about drive, and in some ways you kind of think of capitalism as young run amok, it's all about driving and achieving without also kind of opening to what is a more tender quality. So it's really about the balance between yin and yang, or fierceness and tenderness, where we find health and well-being.
Thank you so much. So you've touched on so many different points, and I want to now talk a little bit about climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. So if our listeners are not familiar, I'll just take a moment to sort of define it a little bit. It's described by the American Psychological Association, eco-anxiety, as a chronic fear of environmental doom. Yeah. And it's a fairly recently diagnosed psychological disorder, and it afflicts many people. So there's talk about it, there's research about it, and there's now lots of different modalities of grief therapy when people suffer for eco-anxiety. Some of these include, ecotherapy includes like horticultural therapy, green exercise, wilderness therapy, natural lifestyle therapy, etc. So I'm just wondering, from your personal or professional point of view, can you help us understand what it's meant when we speak about climate anxiety or eco-grief?
Right. When you were talking about eco-anxiety, I thought, is that a problem or is that wisdom? I mean, in a way, it's more deranged that we don't have anxiety, that we ignore the facts about, what we're doing to this planet,
Right.
I mean, obviously there's balance. We
Right.
want to have some anxiety. We have to have some anxiety because there's a real present danger obviously you wouldn't be doing this show if you didn't think that.
Yeah.
Just when it starts to become overwhelming or overbearing, so that you can't actually live your life because the anxiety is so high that it really does become a problem. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about very much about it in terms of the research. I would imagine that something like self-compassion would be well, we know in general, self-compassion is a really strong antidote to anxiety.
Right.
And again, especially with the more yin, tender side of it, when we can kind of accept the fact that, well, we can't control things. We can't, we can do what we can, and we need to try to do what we can, but we aren't in total control. Giving ourselves support and kindness, especially when we feel out of control, can be very helpful to keep us from going over the edge of anxiety.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think quoting you from earlier talks, you said that we cannot ignore our pain and feel compassion for it at the same time. So if our listeners, or even if myself, if I could say for myself, I have a deep, in the background, I have a lot of anxiety for the environment. I don't often think about it. I don't ruminate about it. But if I take a moment and open up to it, I think, wow, you know what? It's pretty bad out there. I've spoken to people. I've been to group meetings where people have broken down in tears, and with the understanding or perception that their own grandchildren will never live out their natural lives. It's unlikely because of this situation, and it's heartbreaking.
My son is autistic, right? And he's 19 now. And I just think, what's going to happen in his lifetime when he's 70? Not only what's the world going to be like, and especially because he's got special needs, and I just it does break my heart. And I think that's another way self-compassion can help, is because the pain it's so big that we can't even begin to take it in. It's just so overwhelming. And so what self-compassion can do is help us when we know we're going to be there for ourselves, to help support ourselves emotionally as we open to pain. I think it's almost impossible to completely open to it. Maybe some people can, but it's so overwhelming. But we need to kind of like open the door a little bit, and then maybe we need to slightly close it because it's too overwhelming. But but it's an appropriate response. Grief and anxiety are appropriate responses for what's happening. It's if we don't make changes, it's already. I mean, I'm going to admit this. Sometimes I wonder if it's, well, I shouldn't say this, but you start feeling it's too late. I hope not. But that's incredibly depressing.